If you've ever had to make an impossible choice when everything was falling apart around you, when you had to trust your instincts even though everyone thought you were out of your mind, then hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will show you what real courage looks like when there's absolutely no room for doubt. The winter of 1944 arrived in northern France like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the countryside, blanketing the war-torn landscape in deceptive white purity that did nothing to hide the destruction beneath. The small town of Abbeville, once a charming collection of medieval buildings and cobblestone streets, now stood as a skeletal reminder of what happens when history's darkest forces collide. Half the buildings were reduced to rubble, their centuries-old stones scattered like children's blocks kicked over in rage. The Gothic church that had stood for 400 years was missing its entire western wall, and through the gaping wound, wind howled like the ghosts of all those who had perished in this endless conflict. Sarah Mitchell was 26 years old that winter, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived twice that long. She had arrived in France 6 months earlier as part of the Army Nurse Corps, one of thousands of American women who had volunteered to serve overseas, driven by a combination of patriotism, adventure, and a desperate need to do something meaningful while the world tore itself apart. She had grown up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the daughter of a pharmacist and a schoolteacher, in a house where medical journals sat on the coffee table next to copies of National Geographic. Her childhood had been unremarkably normal, filled with school plays, church socials, and summer afternoons spent reading under the big oak tree in their backyard. She had dreamed of becoming a doctor, but in 1936, when she graduated high school, medical schools weren't exactly throwing open their doors to women. So she had done what ambitious young women did in those days when their dreams hit the wall of social expectations. She became a nurse instead, graduated top of her class from Mercy Hospital School of Nursing in 1939, and spent 3 years working in Chicago hospitals before the war changed everything. The field hospital where Sarah worked was housed in what had once been a textile factory on the outskirts of Abbeville. The building's large open floor plan made it practical for medical operations, but its thin walls and broken windows made it miserable for everything else. Cold seeped through every crack and crevice, making the nights almost unbearable despite the small wood-burning stoves scattered throughout the space. The smell was a constant assault, a nauseating mixture of antiseptic, unwashed bodies, gangrene blood, and the peculiar sweetness of infection that every medic learned to recognize and dread. Rows of cots stretched across the factory floor, separated by thin curtains that provided the illusion of privacy, while doing nothing to muffle the sounds of pain that echoed through the space at all hours. Men cried out in the night, some calling for their mothers, others screaming words that made no sense, their minds trapped in the moment of their wounding, playing it over and over like a broken phonograph record. Sarah had been working a 14-hour shift when she first heard about the orphanage. It was late afternoon on December 18th, and she was changing the dressing on a young private's leg wound when Captain Richard Henderson approached her station. Henderson was a senior medical officer, a Boston surgeon who had practiced at Massachusetts General before the war. He was in his mid-40s, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines carved around his eyes from too many nights spent operating under inadequate light. He was known for being calm under pressure, the kind of man who could amputate a leg while enemy shells landed close enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. But that afternoon, Sarah saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Worry. Real, unvarnished worry. "Mitchell, when you finish up here, I need to see you in my office," he said quietly, his Boston accent clipping the word short. He didn't wait for her response, just turned and walked back toward the small room at the rear of the building that served as his combination office, supply closet, and refuge. Sarah finished wrapping the private's leg, gave him 2 aspirin from her dwindling supply, and told him to keep his weight off it for another 3 days, knowing full well he'd probably be back on his feet by tomorrow, because staying in bed felt too much like giving up. She washed her hands in a basin of lukewarm water, dried them on a towel that had been white once upon a time but was now a perpetual gray despite repeated boiling, and made her way to Henderson's office. The captain was standing by the window when she entered, looking out at the snow that had started falling again. The light was fading fast. In northern France in December, darkness came early and stayed late, as if even the sun couldn't bear to look at what humanity had done to this corner of the world. "Close the door," Henderson said without turning around. Sarah did as instructed, feeling a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. In 6 months of working under Henderson, she had never been called into his office like this. When he finally turned to face her, she could see exhaustion written in every line of his face. "There's an orphanage," he began without preamble, "about 8 miles east of here, in a village called Drukat. Before the war, it was run by an order of Benedictine nuns. The place housed maybe 20 children, mostly local farm kids whose parents died from disease or accidents. When the Germans occupied this area, the number of orphans grew. A lot. Parents killed in bombings, resistance members executed, and leaving children behind. Jews who managed to get their children to safety before they themselves were taken away. By last count, there were 73 children in that orphanage." Sarah nodded, not yet understanding why she was hearing this. Henderson continued, his voice carefully controlled. 2 days ago, we got word that the entire village was evacuated. The Germans are falling back, but they're fighting for every mile. The front line is moving, and Drukat is right in the middle of it. Military command ordered everyone out. The nuns loaded the children onto whatever transport they could find and headed west towards safer territory. But something went wrong. One of the trucks broke down about 4 miles from here. 22 children and 2 nuns were left stranded. By the time they got word to us and we could organize a rescue, the weather had turned bad and the fighting had intensified. They've been sheltering in an abandoned farmhouse for the last 36 hours. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened. What do they need? 3 of the children are sick, very sick. One of the nuns has some nursing training, but she's out of her depth. She sent a runner to us this morning. 2 of the children have pneumonia, she thinks. The 3rd has what sounds like acute appendicitis. Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. The appendicitis case is the critical one. A boy 9 years old. If his appendix ruptures, he'll be dead in days, maybe sooner. Sarah understood before he said it. You need someone to go to them. I need someone to operate. In that farmhouse, with whatever equipment they can carry on foot. Henderson's eyes met hers directly. I'm not going to order anyone to do this, Mitchell. The route to that farmhouse goes through contested territory. We've got reports of German patrols in the area, and our own artillery is shelling positions less than 2 miles away. The weather is getting worse, which means air support is non-existent. Whoever goes out there is taking a serious risk. Why not bring the children here? We tried, sent out a transport this morning. It made it halfway before running into a German patrol. Had to turn back. Command says they can't spare the vehicles or the men for another attempt, not with the offensive they're planning. As far as they're concerned, those children need to wait until the front line moves and the area is secure. His voice hardened. That boy doesn't have time to wait. 48 hours, maybe 72 if he's lucky. After that, peritonitis sets in, and nothing we do will matter. Sarah looked at the floor, her mind racing. She thought about the boy, 9 years old, lying in some cold farmhouse, his stomach a knot of pain that would only get worse. She thought about his appendix, inflamed and swelling, a ticking time bomb inside his small body. She thought about the absurdity of surviving bombs and occupation and the chaos of war only to die from something as mundane as appendicitis because the adults around him were too busy killing each other to save one sick child. I'll go, she said quietly. Henderson nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer, but had hoped she might surprise him with a different one. I'll send someone with you. Corporal Davies knows the area, and he's a good man in a tight spot. What equipment can I take? Not much. You'll be on foot most of the way. Basic surgical kit, some instruments, whatever antibiotics and anesthesia we can spare. Morphine, bandages. I'll put together what I can. He moved to his desk and pulled out a map, spreading it across the cluttered surface. Here's where you are. Here's where they are. The route is marked. Stick to it as much as you can, but be prepared to improvise. If you run into trouble, Germans or otherwise, you get yourself to safety. That's an order. Sarah studied the map, committing the route to memory. 8 miles didn't sound like much, but in winter at night, through contested territory. It might as well have been 80. When do I leave? Tonight, as soon as it's fully dark. The darkness gives you cover, but also makes navigation harder. Henderson looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been regret. Mitchell, you don't have to do this. I meant what I said. I'm not ordering you. I know, Sarah replied, but that doesn't change anything. If I don't go, he dies. That's not really a choice at all. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah gathered her equipment with methodical care, knowing that everything she brought would have to be carried on her back, and that every ounce would matter after the first mile. The surgical kit was compact but comprehensive, a marvel of military efficiency that contained scalpels, forceps, clamps, sutures, and all the basic tools she would need. She packed it carefully in a canvas rucksack, wrapping each instrument in cloth to prevent rattling. Antibiotics went in next, precious vials of sulfanilamide that were worth more than gold out here, morphine syringes, enough for the boy and maybe some for the other children if they needed it, bandages, compresses, adhesive tape, a bottle of ether for anesthesia, wrapped in extra layers of cloth because if that bottle broke. The entire operation would be impossible. She changed into warmer clothes, layering long underwear under her uniform, adding a heavy wool sweater and a borrowed army jacket that was too big for her frame but would keep her alive in the cold. Wool socks, 2 pairs, boots that she had worn in for months and trusted completely, a wool cap that pulled down over her ears, gloves that she could work in if necessary, a flashlight with red filter, because red light didn't destroy night vision the way white light did, a canteen of water, some crackers and chocolate in her pocket. Though she doubted she would be hungry, Corporal Michael Davies met her at the designated time, just after full dark. He was a farm boy from Minnesota, 23 years old, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from growing up doing manual labor. He had been in France since D-Day, had seen more combat than anyone his age should have to see, and carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly what violence looked like and how to survive it. He was carrying a rifle and wore a pistol on his belt, along with his own rucksack of supplies. "Ma'am," he greeted her with a nod. His breath came out in white clouds in the cold air. "Captain says we're going to play Florence Nightingale in the middle of a shooting gallery." "Something like that," Sarah replied, adjusting the straps on her pack. "Well then, we'd better get moving. Weather's going to get worse before it gets better, and I'd like to make the halfway point before midnight." He pulled out a compass and a map, oriented himself, and started walking. "Stay close and stay quiet. If I stop, you stop. If I drop, you drop. If I run, you run. Clear, clear." They moved out into the night, leaving the relative safety of the field hospital behind. The snow had stopped the moment, but the clouds remained thick overhead, blocking out any moonlight or starlight that might have helped them see. Davies navigated by compass and memory, following farm tracks and hedgerows that gave them cover from casual observation. The landscape around them was a study in destruction. Shelled buildings stood like broken teeth against the horizon. Barbed wire stretched across fields that should have been growing wheat. Abandoned equipment rusted in ditches, testament to battles fought and lost. They passed a burned-out tank, American by the looks of it, and Sarah tried not to think about the crew that had been inside when it burned. The cold was brutal. Despite all her layers, Sarah could feel it seeping into her bones, making her muscles ache and her joints stiff. Her breath froze on the scarf she had wrapped across her face, creating a layer of ice that scratched her skin. The pack on her back felt heavier with each mile, and she found herself counting steps just to keep her mind occupied. 100 steps, then another 100, then another. Small goals to make the larger one achievable. They had been walking for about 2 hours when Davies held up a hand and dropped into a crouch behind a stone wall. Sarah followed instantly, her heart suddenly pounding. For a long moment, they stayed frozen listening. Then Sarah heard it. Voices, German voices, speaking low but clear in the quiet night. They were close, maybe 50 yards away, hidden by the darkness in a row of bare trees. Davies pointed to the left, indicating a route that would take them around the German patrol. They moved in absolute silence, each step placed with excruciating care, breathing through their mouths to minimize noise. The voices continued for several minutes, then faded as a patrol moved away in a different direction. Davies waited a full 10 minutes after the last sound before he rose and continued forward. He said nothing, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. This was exactly the kind of encounter that could go wrong in a heartbeat. They reached the halfway point just after midnight, a ruined barn that provided some shelter from the wind. Davies allowed them a 5-minute rest. No more. Sarah's legs were screaming, and her feet were starting to go numb despite the wool socks. She forced herself to eat some chocolate and drink some water, knowing that her body needed fuel even if she didn't feel hungry. Davies checked his compass again, consulted the map, and then they were moving once more. The second half of the journey was worse than the first. The temperature dropped even further, and the wind picked up, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. Sarah's face felt frozen, and she had lost feeling in her toes completely. Exhaustion was setting in, making every step an act of will. She focused on Davies' back, on matching his pace, on not falling behind. Somewhere in the distance, artillery boomed, the sound rolling across the landscape like thunder. Flares occasionally lit up the sky, casting everything in harsh, flickering light before darkness returned. It was nearly 3 a.m. when they finally saw the farmhouse. It sat in a small depression, surrounded by skeletal trees and what had once been crop fields. The building was 2 stories, made of stone, with most of its windows broken and part of the roof collapsed. But it was standing, and there was a faint glow of light visible through one of the ground floor windows, carefully covered but not quite hidden. Davies approached cautiously, circling the building once to make sure it wasn't being watched before he finally knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. After a moment, the door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared, pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Thank God," she breathed in French-accented English. "We thought no one was coming." Inside the farmhouse, the situation was even more dire than Sarah had imagined. The main room had been converted into a makeshift shelter, with blankets hung over the windows and mattresses and pallets spread across the floor where children slept huddled together for warmth. A small fire burned in the fireplace, more for morale than actual heat. The 2 nuns, Sister Marie and Sister Catherine, looked like they hadn't slept in days. Sister Marie was the one with nursing training, a tall woman in her 50s whose habit was stained and worn. Sister Catherine was younger, maybe 30, with a round face that probably smiled easily under better circumstances, but now showed only worry. The children ranged in age from about 4 to maybe 13, and they all had the same look in their eyes, a haunted quality that came from seeing too much too young. Some were French, some Belgian. A few Jewish children with papers that gave them false Christian names and new identities. They watched Sarah and Davies with a mixture of hope and fear, these strange soldiers who had appeared in the middle of the night. "The boy is upstairs," Sister Marie said without preamble. "Pierre, he's been getting worse. The fever has him now." Sarah followed her up the narrow staircase to a small room where a child lay on a cot, covered in blankets. Pierre looked younger than 9, small and thin, with dark hair plastered his forehead with sweat despite the cold. His face was flushed with fever, and when Sarah gently pressed on his lower right abdomen, he cried out in pain. The classic signs were all there: tenderness at McBurney's point, guarding, rebound pain. His appendix was inflamed and dangerous, a time bomb that could go off at any moment. "How long has he been like this?" Sarah asked, pulling out her stethoscope to listen to his heartbeat. "The pain started 3 days ago," Sister Marie replied. "At first, we thought it was just a stomach ache, but yesterday it got much worse. He can't eat, can't keep anything down. The fever started last night. 3 days. Sarah did the math in her head. His appendix could rupture at any time now, if it hadn't already." She checked his vital signs, noting the rapid pulse and elevated temperature. His abdomen was rigid, a bad sign. Every moment of delay increased the risk. "I need to operate now," Sarah said, making a decision. "Tonight, we can't wait for morning." Sister Marie's eyes widened. "Here? But you have no proper equipment, no operating room, no anesthesia, no." "I have everything I need," Sarah interrupted, more confidently than she felt. I've seen surgeons operate in worse conditions. We can do this. We have to do this. What Sarah didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that she had never actually performed an appendectomy herself. She had assisted in dozens of them during her training and her time at the field hospital. She knew the procedure inside and out, could probably draw you a diagram of exactly where to cut and what to clamp and how to tie off the blood vessels. But assisting and operating were two entirely different things. Standing beside a surgeon, handing him instruments, that was one thing. Being the surgeon, making the cuts, having a child's life depend entirely on the steadiness of your hands and the accuracy of your decisions, that was something else entirely. But there was no choice. Henderson couldn't come, couldn't spare the time or take the risk. No other surgeon was available. It was Sarah or no one. And no one meant Pierre would die, slowly and painfully, from something entirely preventable if only they had been somewhere else, sometime else. She pushed the doubt down deep and switched into operational mode. I need this room cleared of everything except the cot. I need the cot moved to the center of the room under the best light you can give me. I need clean water, as much as you can boil. I need clean cloth, sheets, anything that can be sterilized. I need someone to assist me who can follow instructions without hesitation. Sister Marie nodded slowly. I can assist. I've seen operations before. Good. We start in 1 hour. That gives us time to prepare everything properly. Corporal Davies, I need you to stand guard. If anyone approaches this house, Germans or otherwise, I need to know immediately. Davies nodded and headed downstairs. The next hour was a flurry of preparation. The room was cleared and scrubbed as best as possible. Sarah boiled her instruments in a pot over the fire, letting them bubble away for a full 20 minutes to ensure they were as sterile as field conditions would allow. She laid out her equipment on a clean cloth, arranging everything in the order she would need it. Scalpel, forceps, clamps, sutures, sponges. She prepared the ether, calculating the dosage for a child Pierre's size. Too much would kill him. Too little would leave him awake and screaming during the surgery. She had to get it exactly right. Sister Marie proved to be a capable assistant, moving with quiet efficiency and asking good questions. She helped Sarah scrub her hands with the limited soap they had, using boiled water that was still hot enough to hurt. They worked by the light of 3 oil lamps and 2 flashlights, positioned to give maximum illumination over the operating area. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even close to ideal, but it would have to do. Pierre was semi-conscious by the time they were ready, the fever and pain dragging him in and out of awareness. Sarah administered the ether carefully, dripping it onto a cloth held over his nose and mouth, watching his breathing closely, counting his heartbeats. Too fast, too shallow, and she lightened the dose. When his muscles finally relaxed and his breathing evened out, she knew he was under. She looked at Sister Marie. Once I start, we can't stop. No matter what happens. Do you understand? I understand, the nun replied, her voice steady. Sarah picked up the scalpel. For just a moment, her hand trembled. Then she thought about all those hours spent watching surgeons work, all those procedures she had assisted with, all the knowledge she had accumulated. She thought about Pierre, about the fact that doing nothing was the same as killing him. She thought about why she had become a nurse in the first place, about the oath she had taken to do no harm and to help whenever she could. The trembling stopped. Her hand steadied. She made the first incision. The procedure that followed was both terrifying and strangely beautiful in its precision. Sarah's hands moved almost automatically, muscle memory and training taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. She cut through skin and fat, carefully parting the layers of muscle, clamping blood vessels as she went. The light from the lamps was barely adequate, casting shadows that made it hard to see, and she found herself leaning in close, squinting to make out the anatomical landmarks she needed. Sister Marie was excellent, anticipating what Sarah needed before she asked for it, keeping the surgical field clear, dabbing away blood, so Sarah could see what she was doing. The nun's hands never shook, never hesitated, even when the operation took longer than it should have, because Sarah had to work so carefully with inadequate light and unfamiliar territory. When Sarah finally located the appendix, she felt a surge of relief mixed with new fear. The organ was inflamed and swollen, angry red against the surrounding tissue, but it hadn't ruptured yet. They had made it in time. Just barely, but they had made it. She clamped the blood supply, carefully removed the diseased appendix, and closed off the stump with sutures that she prayed would hold. Then came the painstaking process of closing him back up, layer by layer, making sure everything was as secure as she could make it. The entire operation took nearly 2 hours. By the time Sarah tied off the final suture and stepped back, her hands were cramping and her back ached from bending over the cot. Sweat dripped down her face despite the cold, and she realized she was shaking from the adrenaline and exertion. But Pierre was still breathing, steady and regular, his color already looking better than before. "We did it," Sister Marie whispered, sounding awed. "We did it," Sarah agreed, hardly believing herself. They cleaned Pierre up, dressed the wound with a precious sulfur powder and clean bandages, and covered him with blankets. Sarah gave him a shot of morphine to manage the pain when he woke up. Then there was nothing to do but wait and watch and pray that infection wouldn't set in, that she hadn't missed something, that her makeshift surgery would be enough. The other 2 sick children, the ones with pneumonia, were easier to treat. Sarah administered antibiotics and made them as comfortable as possible, knowing that time and rest were the best medicine for respiratory infections. Both children were young, maybe 5 and 7, a boy and a girl, who might have been siblings, though no one seemed to know for sure. Their breathing was labored but not critical, and Sarah felt cautiously optimistic that they would recover if given the chance. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through broken windows. Davies came upstairs to report that the night had been quiet, no patrols, no incidents. Sarah realized she had been awake for nearly 24 hours and felt every minute of it. Sister Catherine brought her some ersatz coffee, bitter and thin but hot, and Sarah drank it gratefully. "What you did," Sister Marie said quietly, sitting beside Sarah as they watched Pierre sleep. "It was extraordinary. I've seen trained surgeons refuse to operate in better conditions than this. You gave that boy his life back." "I just did what needed to be done," Sarah replied, too tired for modesty or false humility. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," the nun said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have said it was impossible. Too risky. Too dangerous. They would have found reasons why it couldn't be done. You found a way to do it anyway." Sarah didn't have a response to that. She sipped her coffee and watched Pierre breathe and tried not to think about all the things that could still go wrong. They stayed at the farmhouse for 3 days. The front line shifted, moving east as Allied forces pushed forward, and suddenly the area around Drukat was no longer contested territory, but secure ground. On the 2nd day, Pierre woke up groggy and confused but alive. His fever broke on the 3rd day, and by then, Sarah was confident that he would survive. The wound was healing cleanly, showing no signs of infection. The other 2 children were also improving, their breathing easier, their color better. On the afternoon of the 4th day, transport arrived from the field hospital. Trucks and ambulances, a proper convoy with armed escorts, ready to evacuate everyone to safety. Captain Henderson himself rode in the lead vehicle, and when he saw Pierre sitting up and even managing a weak smile, his usually stern face broke into a grin. "Mitchell, you magnificent, crazy woman," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "When I sent you out here, I honestly thought I might be signing your death warrant. Instead, you pull off battlefield surgery that most surgeons wouldn't attempt in a proper hospital. How the hell did you do it?" Sarah shrugged, suddenly exhausted beyond words. "I didn't think about it too much. I just did what needed to be done, one step at a time." The evacuation went smoothly. The children were loaded onto trucks with gentle care, wrapped in blankets and given hot soup and chocolate. The nuns insisted on staying with them, refusing to be separated. Pierre was placed on a stretcher, despite his protest that he could walk, and Sarah rode in the ambulance beside him, monitoring his vital signs and changing his dressing one more time. Back at the field hospital, Pierre became something of a celebrity. Word spread quickly about the American nurse who had performed an emergency appendectomy in an abandoned farmhouse under impossible conditions. Soldiers stopped by to see the boy, bringing him candy and comic books, treating him like a lucky charm. The other patients in the hospital, men who had seen the worst of war and survived, looked at Pierre and seemed to find hope in the idea that even in the middle of all this destruction, one sick kid could still be saved. Sarah deflected the attention as much as possible, uncomfortable with the hero worship. She knew the truth that others seemed to miss. She hadn't been brave. She had been terrified the entire time, certain she was going to make a mistake, convinced that she was in over her head. The only reason she had succeeded was because she hadn't allowed herself to think about failing. She had focused on the next step, and then the next, and then the next, until suddenly it was done. But something had changed inside her during those hours in the farmhouse. She had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. She was capable of more than she had imagined. When everything was on the line and there was no one else to depend on, she could trust her training, her instincts, and her own hands to do what needed to be done. It was a terrifying revelation and an empowering one at the same time. The war continued, of course. Battles were fought and won and lost. Men died in vast numbers for reasons that seemed increasingly pointless the longer the conflict dragged on. Sarah continued to work at the field hospital, treating the endless stream of wounded that flowed through their doors. She performed triage, changed dressings, held hands, wrote letters home for soldiers too injured to write themselves, and witnessed death in all its arbitrary cruelty. But she also witnessed something else. She saw humans at their best, acting with courage and selflessness in conditions designed to bring out their worst. She saw medics running into fire to rescue wounded comrades. She saw soldiers sharing their last cigarette with a dying enemy. She saw children who had every reason to despair, still finding ways to smile and play and hold on to hope. And she saw that even in the darkest moments, when everything seemed lost, one person making one impossible choice could change the outcome entirely. Pierre recovered fully. By January, he was running around the hospital, helping the nurses with small tasks, charming everyone with his gap-toothed smile and his absolute determination to repay the kindness he had been shown. Sister Marie stayed on as well, working alongside the nurses and becoming an invaluable member of the medical team. She and Sarah developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience, the kind of bond that only forms when people go through something extraordinary together. In February, Sarah received a letter from Henderson recommending her for commendation. She also received a letter from Pierre, written in careful French with English translations provided by Sister Marie. In it, he thanked her for his life and promised to become a doctor when he grew up so he could help other people the way she had helped him. Sarah kept that letter with her for the rest of the war, folded carefully in her breast pocket. A reminder of why she was there and what mattered. The orphanage was eventually rebuilt in a different location, far from the front lines. All 22 children who had been stranded in that farmhouse survived the war. Some were reunited with relatives who had survived. Others were adopted by families looking to rebuild their lives with children who needed homes. A few stayed with the sisters, helping to run the new orphanage and care for a new generation of children displaced by conflict. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Sarah was still in France when the news came through, still working at a field hospital, though by then they were treating fewer combat casualties and more cases of disease and exhaustion as occupation forces settled into peacetime routines. She stood outside the hospital on VE Day, listening to the celebrations echoing across the town, watching fireworks light up the night sky, and felt a strange emptiness. So many dead, so much destruction, and for what? So that the world could start the long, painful process of rebuilding what it had torn down in its madness. She thought about Pierre, about those 3 days in the farmhouse, about the moment she had picked up that scalpel with no one to help her and no certainty that she could do what needed to be done. That moment had defined her more than anything else in her life. Not because of the outcome, though she was profoundly grateful that Pierre had lived, but because of the choice itself. The decision to try, even when success seemed impossible. The willingness to act, even when fear screamed at her to stay safe and let someone else take the risk. Sarah returned to the United States in August of 1945, sailing into New York Harbor on a transport ship filled with nurses and soldiers heading home. The skyline of the city rose before her like a promise, and she felt the weight of the past year beginning to lift from her shoulders. She was 27 years old. She had seen things no one should have to see, done things she never imagined she would have to do, and survived experiences that would mark her for the rest of her life. But she had also discovered who she was, what she was capable of, and what she believed in with absolute certainty. She believed in doing what needed to be done, even when it was impossible. She believed in trusting yourself when there was no one else to trust. She believed in the stubborn refusal to give up on a single life, even when the world was busy destroying millions. And she believed that one person in one moment, making one crazy decision, could change everything for at least one other person. And sometimes that was enough. Sarah never stopped being a nurse. She went back to Chicago, worked at Cook County Hospital for 35 years, and trained hundreds of young nurses who went on to save thousands of lives. She married in 1949 a lawyer named Thomas who had served in the Pacific and understood the silences that sometimes fell over her when she remembered things she couldn't talk about. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and Sarah made sure all of them understood the importance of service, of doing difficult things because they needed to be done, not because they were easy or safe or guaranteed to succeed. She stayed in touch with Pierre through letters. He did become a doctor, just as he had promised. He specialized in pediatric surgery and spent his career working in developing countries, providing medical care to children who had no other access to it. In his letters, he always thanked her for showing him that impossible things were possible if you simply refused to accept impossibility as an answer. He named his first daughter Sarah. Sister Marie eventually became Mother Superior of the rebuilt orphanage and ran it for 20 years before retiring. She and Sarah exchanged Christmas cards until Marie died in 1978, and in every card, the nun included the same message written in her careful handwriting. Thank you for reminding me that faith without works is dead, and that sometimes God's miracles require human hands to bring them into the world. Captain Henderson went back to Boston after the war and resumed his surgical practice. He published a paper in a medical journal about field surgery techniques that included an anonymous case study of an appendectomy performed under extreme conditions by a nurse with no surgical training. The paper became required reading in military medical programs and inspired a generation of medics to push the boundaries of what they thought was possible. The farmhouse where Sarah operated on Pierre stood empty for several years after the war. Eventually, it was torn down, and the land was sold to a farmer who planted wheat in the fields where battles had once raged. There's no marker there now, nothing to indicate that anything extraordinary ever happened in that place. But for the people who were there that December night in 1944, the memory remained vivid for the rest of their lives. Sarah lived to be 87 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep in 2005, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, her son read from a letter she had written years earlier, intended to be opened after her death. In it, she talked about her experiences in the war, about the night she operated on Pierre, about the fear and doubt she had felt, and the strange calm that had come over her once she started cutting. She wrote about the lesson she had learned that night, a lesson she had tried to pass on to everyone she met for the rest of her life. "We are all capable of more than we imagine," she wrote. "The circumstances that test us are not the ones we choose, but how we respond to them is always our choice." When you are faced with an impossible situation, when there is no good option and no clear path forward, when every voice around you and inside you is telling you to give up or play it safe, remember this. One person making one brave choice can change the trajectory of another person's entire life. It may not change the world. It may not even change your corner of the world. But it will change something, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes saving one life in one moment, with one crazy fix that everyone thinks will fail, is the most important thing you will ever do, and you won't know if you can do it until you try. The letter ended with a postscript, added in shakier handwriting years later. "Pierre visited me last month. He's 70 now, a grandfather, still practicing medicine in places most people have never heard of. He brought me flowers and photographs of his grandchildren and told me stories about all the lives he saved in his career. Thousands of them, he thinks, though he doesn't keep count. Before he left, he thanked me again for that night in the farmhouse, and I told him the same thing I told him the first time he thanked me. I didn't save his life. I just refused to let him die without trying. There's a difference. The trying is the part we control. The outcome is in God's hands, or fate's hands, or just a random mercy of circumstance. But the trying, that's ours. And we owe it to each other to try, even when it seems crazy, especially when it seems crazy, because sometimes crazy is the only thing that works when everything sensible has failed. In a small town in southern France, there is a hospital named after Pierre Beaumont, the boy who survived impossible odds because one American nurse refused to accept that impossible meant inevitable. The hospital specializes in pediatric care and serves children from across the region, many of them refugees and orphans, continuing the work that began in that farmhouse so many decades ago. In the main lobby, there's a photograph of Sarah Mitchell in her Army Nurse Corps uniform, young and serious, looking directly at the camera with eyes that had seen too much but still held hope. Under the photograph is a plaque with words in French and English. To Sarah Mitchell, who taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, who showed us that one person with steady hands and a stubborn heart can change the world one life at a time, who proved that the craziest fix is sometimes the only fix that works. We remember, we honor, we continue the work. And in hospitals and homes and small moments of crisis all over the world, people still make impossible choices every day. They try when trying seems pointless. They act when action seems futile. They refuse to give up when giving up would be so much easier. They do it because someone has to, because no one else is there to do it, because one life matters even when the world suggests otherwise. They do it because somewhere in their past, someone told them a story about a young nurse in a frozen farmhouse who picked up a scalpel with trembling hands and steady purpose and saved a boy's life when everyone said it couldn't be done. They do it because they understand the truth that Sarah Mitchell learned on that December night in 1944, that we are all capable of our own crazy fixes when the moment demands it, that the impossible is just another word for something no one has figured out how to do yet, and that the most important question is never whether we can succeed, but whether we're willing to try. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Pierre Beaumont is not about war, though war was a context in which it happened. It's not about medicine, though medicine was the tool she used. It's about the fundamental human capacity to look at an impossible situation and say, I'll try anyway. It's about the courage that comes not from confidence, but from necessity. It's about the choices we make when there are no good choices, when every option is terrifying and uncertain, but one option at least offers a chance while the others offer only despair. And it's about the ripples that spread out from those moments of impossible courage, touching lives we'll never meet, inspiring actions we'll never witness, creating a legacy that outlives us by generations. One night, one operation, one crazy fix, one life saved. And from that one life, thousands more touched and changed and saved in turn, an endless succession of miracles made possible because one person refused to accept that miracles were impossible. That's the real story. Not just what Sarah did, but what her action made possible for everyone who came after. The children Pierre saved in his long career. The nurses Sarah trained who went on to train others. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because Pierre survived to have a family. The ripples spreading outward in ever-widening circles, touching lives across decades and continents, all traceable back to that single moment when a young woman picked up a scalpel in a frozen farmhouse and decided that trying was better than accepting defeat. We all face our farmhouse moments, times when we have to choose between the impossible and the unthinkable. And in those moments, we get to decide who we are. We get to choose whether we'll be the person who tries or the person who finds reasons why trying is pointless. We get to write our own story, one crazy fix at a time, one impossible choice after another, until the impossible becomes what we did, and the crazy becomes what worked, and the story becomes the truth of who we were when it mattered most. Sarah Mitchell was a woman who tried. That's her legacy. Not that she always succeeded, though she succeeded that night. Not that she was never afraid, because she was terrified, but that she tried. She picked up that scalpel. She made that cut. She saved that boy. And in doing so, she proved something that every generation needs to learn again. That one person can make a difference. That crazy plan sometimes works. That trying is always better than accepting defeat. and that the most extraordinary things in life often begin with someone looking at an impossible situation and saying 4 simple words, "I'll try anyway."